There will come a time in your life when nothing adds up. You'll pray for answers and hear silence. You'll do everything right and still face everything wrong. The road will twist, the doors will close, and the dreams you thought God gave you will seem to fade away. In those moments, the question isn't a where is God? It's a will you still trust him? Faith isn't proven when everything is clear. Faith is proven when you can't see a thing and you still keep walking. It's easy to trust God when the bills are paid, the diagnosis is clean, and the relationships are healthy. But real faith begins where understanding ends. Sometimes God allows confusion not to punish you, but to prepare you. When life doesn't make sense, it's not because God has lost control. It's because he's leading you somewhere that requires trust more than logic. You see, God doesn't owe you an explanation. He offers you an invitation to lean not on your own understanding, but to trust his heart when you can't trace his hand. There are moments when your plans fall apart, and all you can do is whisper, God, I don't understand. And that whisper, though weak, is still faith. Because faith isn't shouting in confidence, it's holding on quietly when everything in you wants to let go. Think about it. Every hero of faith in Scripture walked through confusion before celebration. Joseph sat in a prison before sitting in a palace. Moses wandered the desert before leading the people. Even Jesus was misunderstood and rejected before resurrection came. Confusion does not mean abandonment. It's often the classroom where God teaches you to depend on him alone. Sometimes you'll look around and feel like God's timing is off. But he's never late. He's just working in ways you can't yet see. The waiting seasons are not wasted seasons. God is arranging people, places, and opportunities behind the scenes. Just because you can't see the story doesn't mean he's not writing it. So, when life doesn't make sense, choose trust. When the path is dark, choose faith. When your heart is breaking, choose surrender. Because the same God who carried you through your last storm is the same God who will guide you through this one. You may not understand the why right now, but one day you'll look back and see that every delay, every detour, every disappointment was necessary to get you to your destiny. God's plan is still perfect, even when it's painful. Hold on to him. Don't give up in the middle of the mystery. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to know the one who does. So, if you're standing in confusion today, lift your eyes. God hasn't forgotten you. The story isn't over. Trust him anyway. Trust him anyway. Stops making sense. It's easy to talk about faith when the skies are clear, when every prayer feels answered, and when you can trace God's fingerprints on every blessing. But faith isn't built in comfort. It's forged in confusion. It's in those moments when life throws questions that have no answers, when prayers seem to echo back in silence, when everything you plan falls apart. That's where true faith begins to grow. Faith is not about understanding every detail of God's plan. It's about trusting his heart when your mind can't comprehend his ways. There comes a time when you find yourself standing in the middle of circumstances that don't line up with what you expected. You thought obedience would bring clarity, but instead it brought uncertainty. You believed that doing the right thing would open doors, but instead it seemed to close them. And as you stand there, surrounded by confusion, you wonder, where is God in all this? Yet, it's in that very place where everything stops making sense that faith is truly tested. Because faith isn't about having proof, it's about having peace even without answers. Sometimes God intentionally allows seasons where life doesn't add up to remind you that your faith isn't meant to rest on logic, but on trust. You see, logic will tell you that what's happening shouldn't be happening. Logic will say the timing is off, the situation is impossible, and the pain is unnecessary. But faith whispers that God is still good. Faith says, I don't see it, but I believe it. It's easy to worship when you understand. It's much harder when all you have is a promise in a storm. But that's where faith matures. It stops being a feeling and becomes a decision. A decision to stand firm even when you can't stand tall. When life stops making sense, most people either panic or pull away. They think confusion means something went wrong. But the truth is, confusion is often the soil where deeper trust grows. God doesn't test your faith to see if you'll fail. He tests it to strengthen it. The same way muscles grow under resistance, faith grows under uncertainty. Well, when everything is stripped away, your plans, your control, your understanding, faith finally has room to breathe. Because then it's no longer about what you can do or figure out. It's about who God is and whether you'll keep believing that He is faithful, even when nothing feels faithful around you. Faith is not a denial of reality. It's confidence in a greater reality. You can acknowledge the pain, the confusion, the fear, and still choose to trust that God's hand is in it all. Faith doesn't mean you don't cry, doubt, or question. It means that in the middle of all of that, you refuse to give up on God. It means that even when your heart breaks, you still choose to say, God, I trust you. That kind of faith doesn't come from religious performance. It comes from relationship. It comes from knowing God well enough to believe that even when you don't understand His plan, you can still trust His purpose. Every person who's ever walked closely with God has had moments that didn't make sense. Abraham was told to leave his home without knowing where he was going. Joseph was given a dream of greatness and then thrown into a pit and a prison. David was anointed king and then hunted like a criminal. None of it made sense at the time. But looking back, each step, no matter how confusing, was leading to a divine outcome. And that's the pattern of faith. You rarely see God's plan while you're in it. You only recognize it after it unfolds. Faith is trusting that what feels like chaos now will one day make sense in the light of God's wisdom. Sometimes life will push you to the edge where you have no explanations left. You'll feel forgotten, unseen, and misunderstood. But that's often where God does His deepest work, because when you have no answers, you learn to depend on the answer Himself. When you can't see the road, you learn to trust the guide. When you lose control, you discover that you were never meant to have it in the first place. The breaking of your understanding is not the end. It's the beginning of a new depth of faith that's no longer built on circumstances, but on conviction. Faith isn't always loud or certain. Sometimes it's quiet and trembling. Sometimes it's simply the decision to take one more step when you don't know what's next. It's the whisper in your soul that says, even though I don't get it, I'm still going to believe. That's the kind of faith that moves mountains, not because you understand how, but because you trust who. God doesn't need you to have it all figured out. He needs you to hold on when everything falls apart. And every time you do, your faith grows stronger, deeper, and more unshakable. So when life stops making sense, that's not the moment to quit. It's the moment to cling, because that's where the substance of faith is revealed. Faith is not found in the easy answers or the clear paths. It's found in the shadows, where you keep believing even when you can't see. God's silence doesn't mean His absence. There are moments when you pray with everything in you, and heaven seems to say nothing back. You wait for a sign, a word, a breakthrough, but all you get is quiet. It can feel like God has turned away, like your voice is lost in the wind. The silence can be heavy, almost suffocating, and your heart begins to whisper, and maybe He's not listening. But the truth is, God's silence is not a sign that He's gone. It's often the evidence that He's working in ways you can't yet see. Silence is not rejection. It's preparation. When God seems silent, He's still speaking, just not in the way you expect. He speaks through patience, through timing, through the shaping of your heart. Silence doesn't mean absence. It means He's inviting you to trust His presence even when you can't feel it. God doesn't measure His love by how much He speaks, but by how faithfully He stays. And though you may not sense Him, He's closer than you think, holding things together behind the scenes, rearranging pieces that would overwhelm you if you revealed them too soon. In those silent seasons, your mind becomes the loudest voice in the room. Doubt begins to echo. Fear starts to grow, and you start replaying your prayers, wondering if you said something wrong or failed some unseen test. But God's silence is not punishment. It's part of His process. He knows that if He answered too quickly, you'd depend on the outcome more than on Him. Sometimes He withholds the noise of reassurance so you can develop the stillness of trust. Silence becomes sacred when you learn to rest in it instead of running from it. There are seasons when silence is the only way God can grow your roots deep enough to handle the fruit that's coming. When he doesn't speak, it's not because he's ignoring you. It's because he's growing you. He's teaching you to discern his presence beyond feelings, to walk by faith and not by sight. The silence is where your spiritual muscles stretch. It's where belief becomes more than words. It becomes endurance. God is shaping a faith that can stand firm even when the noise fades. A faith that isn't dependent on how things look or sound, but on who he is. Look at the moments in Scripture when God seemed silent. Joseph waited in a prison cell with no explanation. Hannah wept for years before her prayer was answered. The Israelites wandered in the desert, wondering if God had forgotten them. Even Jesus on the cross cried out, "Am I God? Why have you forsaken me?" Yet in every case, the silence was not the end. It was the space between the promise and the fulfillment. God was working redemption in the quiet, crafting miracles in the stillness. What felt like absence was divine activity hidden from human sight. God's silence often exposes what's inside of us. It reveals what we truly believe. When the emotional high fades and the answers don't come, silence tests whether our faith is rooted in outcomes or in relationship. It's easy to love God when he's saying yes to everything you want. It's harder when he seems to say nothing at all. But silence has a purpose. It purifies. It burns away the impatience, the pride, the need for control, and it leaves behind something stronger. A heart that trusts God's character even when his voice feels distant. Sometimes God is silent because he has already spoken. You may be waiting for a new word, but he's waiting for you to obey the last one. Or perhaps he's silent because he's protecting you from something you can't handle yet. What looks like delay might be his mercy in disguise. The silence is not a void, it's a shield. God knows what would happen if he gave you what you're asking for before you're ready. So he stays quiet, not to frustrate you, but to form you. He's preparing your heart for the blessing, your mind for the responsibility, your faith for the journey. There's a stillness and silence that trains your spirit to listen differently. When the noise fades, you start noticing whispers, the peace that comes out of nowhere, the strength to keep going, the small signs of grace that say, "I'm still here." That's how God speaks in silence, through the subtle, the unseen, the steady. You won't always hear him, but you'll see his fingerprints. The door that didn't open may have protected you. The delay that disappointed you may have redirected you. The unanswered prayer may have saved you from something you didn't see coming. His silence often hides his greatest mercies. When you feel like God has gone quiet, remember that silence is part of every deep relationship. There are moments in love where no words are needed because presence speaks louder than speech. God's love is the same. He's there even when he's quiet. You may not hear him in the thunder, but you'll find him in the still small voice, the one that doesn't need to shout to be real. In that quiet, he's teaching you to recognize him not by sound, but by trust. Faith matures in the waiting room of silence. It's there that you learn God doesn't need to explain himself to prove himself. It's there that you realize silence is not the absence of his presence. It's often the proof of his confidence in you. He knows you're strong enough to walk by faith, not by sight. He knows that even when the heavens seem still, your heart will keep beating for him. And though you may not hear his voice right now, one day the silence will break and you'll see that he was speaking all along, in the stillness, in the waiting, in the quiet shaping of your soul. Confusion is often preparation, not punishment. When life doesn't unfold the way you imagine, when every plan you made starts falling apart, it's easy to believe that something has gone wrong. You question your choices, your timing, even your worth. You start thinking that maybe God is disappointed in you, that you're somehow being punished. But what feels like chaos to you might actually be God rearranging your life for something greater. Confusion isn't the evidence of his anger. It's often the tool of his construction. When God wants to take you higher, he first has to unsettle what's comfortable. And that often looks like confusion. In moments of confusion, your first instinct is to try and fix things. You want answers, clarity, direction. You think, if I could just understand what's happening, I'd feel peace. But God often withholds understanding because he's building faith. He's not trying to punish you. He's preparing you for a season where understanding won't sustain you, only trust will. When you walk with God, you soon learn that the path to purpose is rarely straight. It twists, it bends, and sometimes it disappears altogether. But those twists are not mistakes. They are divine detours designed to develop you before he promotes you. Confusion humbles you. It forces you to let go of control. You realize that all your careful plans, your timelines, and your strategies can't guarantee the outcome. And in that place of surrender, you begin to see God differently. You begin to understand that his ways are not random. They're higher. The things that confuse you are often the things that will shape you. God doesn't waste your uncertainty. He uses it to prepare you for what certainty cannot teach. There are lessons in confusion that clarity will never give you. Think about the people in Scripture who faced confusion before calling out. Joseph couldn't understand why betrayal led him to slavery or why integrity landed him in prison. But in the background, God was positioning him for influence. Moses couldn't understand why he spent 40 years in the wilderness after being raised in a palace, but that confusion was training for leadership. David was anointed as king, yet spent years running for his life. None of it made sense in the moment, but all of it made sense in the mission. Every confusing season is a setup for a clearer calling later. What you call a setback, God calls training. Confusion stretches your faith beyond comfort. When you don't know what God is doing, you learn to focus on who he is. You stop depending on explanations and start depending on his character. In confusion, God becomes your compass. You start trusting his direction, even when you can't see the destination. He teaches you to walk step by step, not season by season. And that's the essence of faith, not having the full map, but moving forward with the one who does. There's a sacredness to confusion when you realize it's not meant to destroy you, but to develop you. It strips away pride, it silences your ego, and it invites dependence. It's easy to feel close to God when everything is clear. But true intimacy is built in the fog, when you lean in closer because you can't see the road ahead. Confusion creates intimacy with God, because it's in that space of not knowing that you learn to listen more deep, to wait more patiently, and to trust more fully. Sometimes confusion is God's way of protecting you from premature success. If you got what you were praying for too soon, it might destroy you. You may not be emotionally, spiritually, or mentally ready to handle what you've been asking for. So God allows confusion to slow you down, to build wisdom and endurance before promotion. You think you're stuck, but you're being strengthened. You think you're delayed, but you're being developed. The waiting and the wondering are part of your preparation. Confusion also refines your motives. When things stop making sense, you start asking yourself why you really follow God. Is it because of what he gives or because of who he is? When you can't see the reward, but you still choose to obey, that's when your faith becomes genuine. That's when your love becomes pure. God uses confusion to purify your heart from shallow faith, to replace convenience with conviction. You start realizing that faith isn't about always understanding God's plan. It's about trusting his goodness in the middle of the unknown. There's also a quiet strength that grows out of confusion. The strength of patience, the strength of humility, the strength of resilience. You begin to find peace even without clarity. You stop demanding answers and start resting in assurance. You learn that peace doesn't come from knowing the plan, it comes from knowing the planner. That's why the most mature believers often have the calmest hearts in the midst of chaos. They've learned through years of confusion that God's preparation often disguises itself as uncertainty. Sometimes the confusion you feel isn't even about what's happening around you, it's what's happening inside you. God may be rearranging your priorities, your desires, your sense of identity. The confusion you feel is the breaking down of the old you so the new you can emerge. Growth is rarely clean. It's messy, uncomfortable, and disorienting. But that inner confusion is not punishment. It's the process of transformation. God is renewing your mind, healing old wounds, and reordering your heart for something greater. You might not realize it now, but the seasons that confused you the most will later define you the strongest. They will be the chapters you look back on and say, that's where I changed. God often hides his preparation in what looks like confusion, because he knows if you saw the full picture, you might rush ahead or give up too soon. So instead, he allows you to walk through uncertainty, not to hurt you, but to prepare you for the weight of what's coming. When life feels uncertain and your path unclear, remember that confusion is not the sign of God's absence. It's the mark of his molding. Waiting seasons are not wasted seasons. When God places you in a time of waiting, it can feel like everything around you has stopped moving. You see others advancing, doors opening for them, prayers being answered for them while you're standing still. It feels like your prayers are stuck in heaven's inbox. You begin to wonder if you've been forgotten, if your purpose has expired, or if you missed your moment. But the truth is, God does some of his most powerful work in the waiting. What looks like delay from your perspective is often development from his. Waiting is not a punishment, it's preparation. When you're waiting, it's easy to get frustrated because everything in you wants to move forward. We live in a world that worships speed, that values progress, that celebrates the ones who will make it first. But God doesn't measure growth by movement. He measures it by maturity. There are things he wants to build in you before he brings you into what he has for you. If he answered every prayer instantly, you would never learn patience. If he opened every door right away, you would never develop endurance. The waiting is God's classroom, and the lessons you learn there will carry you into your destiny. Waiting exposes what you truly believe about God. When you can't see results, when the timing seems off, when your heart aches from delay, that's when faith is refined. Do you trust God because of what he gives or because of who he is? When you're forced to wait, you begin to see that your faith isn't about getting something from God. It's about growing closer to him. The waiting room is where dependence deepens. It's where you stop praying only for answers and start praying for alignment. You begin to desire his will more than your timeline. In the waiting, God works in ways you cannot see. While you feel stuck, he's setting things in motion. He's aligning people, circumstances, and opportunities to meet you at the exact moment when you're ready. God's timing is never random. It's strategic. Just because he hasn't done it yet doesn't mean he's forgotten. It means he's perfecting every detail so that when the moment comes, everything falls into place. The waiting is not empty time. It's sacred time where heaven is working behind the scenes while your heart learns to trust. Think about how often in Scripture God used waiting to shape his people. Abraham waited decades for the promise of a son. Joseph waited years in prison for his purpose to be revealed. David waited between being anointed and being appointed as king. Even Jesus waited 30 years before beginning his ministry. In each story, the waiting wasn't wasted. It was essential. The waiting prepared their character for the weight of their calling. They didn't just receive a blessing. They became the kind of person who could carry it. That's what waiting does. It turns you from someone who wants a miracle into someone who can handle one. When God makes you wait, he's often protecting you from something you can't yet handle. There are doors that seem good now, but would destroy you if opened too soon. There are opportunities that look appealing, but would pull you out of alignment with your purpose. So God slows you down, not because he's holding out on you, but because he's holding something better for you. Waiting is God's mercy in disguise. He's not delaying to frustrate you. He's delaying to prepare you for what's coming. The longer the wait, the deeper the work he's doing in you. Waiting also teaches obedience. When God tells you to wait, it's a test of whether you trust his wisdom more than your own will. Can you stay faithful when nothing seems to be changing? Can you keep serving, keep believing, keep worshiping while you wait? That's where maturity grows. Many people give up in the middle of waiting because they mistake silence for absence. But the waiting room is where God watches your response. If you can stay faithful in the unseen, you'll be ready for the seen. Waiting reveals whether your faith is based on results or relationship. During the waiting season, God often works on your heart. He deals with the pride, impatience, and fear that would sabotage your future. You may not realize it, but He's pruning away attitudes that don't belong in your next level. He's teaching you to depend less on people and more on Him. The waiting becomes a refining fire that burns away everything that's not meant to go with you. When the right time comes, you won't just step into the blessing. You'll step into it as a different person, stronger, humbler, and wiser. There's a sacred peace that comes when you learn to embrace the waiting instead of resisting it. You begin to realize that every delay carries purpose. You stop asking, when will it happen? And start asking, what are you teaching me right now? The waiting becomes a partnership, not a punishment, not a punishment. It's a space where you and God build something eternal, a deeper trust, steadier heart, a faith that doesn't crumble when circumstances shift. Even when you feel forgotten, you're not. God's delays are deliberate. Every promise He's made still stands. He's just perfecting the process. He doesn't waste pain and He doesn't waste time. What looks like stillness to you is movement in His kingdom. The roots are growing even if the fruit hasn't appeared yet. Every prayer you've prayed, every tear you've cried, every moment you've stayed faithful when it was hard, it's all adding up to something beautiful. Waiting is not about standing still. It's about being still long enough for God to shape you for what's next. When you look back one day, you'll see that the waiting wasn't an interruption in your story. It was a preparation that made the story possible. God was never late, never silent, never absent. He was working through every pause, every delay, every moment of uncertainty to make you ready for the right time. And when that time comes, it will be clear that the waiting was never wasted. It was the hidden season that made everything else make sense. Trust God's plan even when you can't trace His hand. There will be moments when life will make you question everything you thought you knew about God. You'll pray for one thing and receive another. You'll hope for open doors, but find walls instead. We will expect peace, but face storms. In those moments, trusting God can feel almost impossible. You'll want to understand, to figure out what He's doing and why He's doing it. But the truth is, faith was never about having all the answers. It's about resting in the assurance that God does. You may not see His hand at work, but His plan is still unfolding with precision and purpose. When God seems hidden, it's not because He's distant. It's because He's doing something deep, something that requires your trust more than your sight. If God showed you every step ahead, you'd never learn to depend on Him. He hides certain things because trust can only grow in mystery. It's in the spaces where you can't trace His hand that you learn to follow His heart. Trusting God means believing that even when you can't see the full picture, He's painting something beautiful behind the scenes. Every stroke, even the dark ones, has a place in the masterpiece He's creating with your life. There will be seasons when you feel like your prayers hit the ceiling and fall back down. You'll question if He hears you, if He cares, or if He's even there. But God is not silent because He's absent. He's silent because He's sovereign. He knows what you don't know. He sees what you can't see. Sometimes the reason you can't trace His hand is because He's guiding you through paths that require blind faith. The very place that confuses you is often the place where He's building your courage. When life doesn't go according to your plan, it's because God's plan is still on schedule, still on schedule. Trusting God isn't pretending everything is fine. It's about believing He's still in control when everything feels like it's falling apart. It's about saying, God, I don't get it, but I know You're good. That's not weakness, that's worship. It's choosing surrender over struggle, faith over fear, peace over panic. You may not understand how losing something could ever work for your good, but God promises that it will. The things that seem to break you are often the very things that build you. When you can't trace His hand, look back on your life and remember the times He carried you before. The same God who was faithful then hasn't changed now. Sometimes trusting God means releasing your need to control. You can't see the outcome, but you can choose obedience. You can't predict tomorrow, but you can be faithful today. That's what walking by faith really means. doing what's right even when the results are hidden. Every step of trust is a declaration that says, no, I don't have to see it to believe it. And with each step, he strengthens your heart, deepens your roots, and prepares you for the blessings ahead. God doesn't need you to understand, he just needs you to keep walking. When you can't trace his hand, remember that God's delays are not denials. The waiting is not a sign of neglect. It's part of the process. He's aligning every detail, every connection, every opportunity according to his perfect timing. If he gave you everything now, you wouldn't appreciate it or sustain it. So instead, he makes you wait, trust, and grow. He lets your faith mature until it can carry the weight of what he's planned. Every promise has a process, and every process requires patience. You're not being forgotten. You're being prepared. Trusting God also means believing that he knows better than you do. You might think you know what's best for your life, but your vision is limited by time and perspective. God sees the beginning and the end. He knows which doors should open and which ones must stay closed. What you call disappointment might actually be his divine protection. Sometimes his I know is saving you from something you can't see yet. He doesn't take things away to leave you empty. He removes them to make room for better. When you learn to trust him, even when his plan doesn't match your preference, peace starts to replace anxiety. You don't have to understand the plan to walk in purpose. Trust doesn't require full knowledge. It requires full surrender. It's the willingness to say, God, I don't need all the details. I just need to know you're with me. And he is. He promised never to leave you nor forsake you. Even in the silence, he's near. Even in the confusion, he's working. Even in the pain, he's present. You may not trace his hand right now, but one day you'll look back and see that his fingerprints were all over your story. Trusting God when you can't trace his hand is an act of strength, not naivety. It's the ultimate declaration that says, my faith is bigger than my fear. It's standing firm in the middle of the unknown and believing that his plan is still perfect. The storms, the setbacks, the unanswered prayers, they're all threads in a tapestry that will one day reveal his glory. You may not see how it all connects now, but one day it will make perfect sense. So when you can't trace his hand, hold on to his heart. When you don't understand his plan, trust his character. He's not just the God of clarity, he's the God of mystery, and both belong to him. You may feel like your story is off track, but in God's timing, every detour has direction. You're not lost, you're being led. Trust him through the confusion, the silence, and the waiting. Because one day, when it all comes together, you'll realize that his hand was never missing. It was guiding you all along, even when you couldn't see it. Trust God's plan even when you can't trace his hand. Because his plan is always better than yours, and his ways are always worth the wait.